All right. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Brian Katulis, a senior fellow here at the Center for American Progress. We've been looking forward to having this discussion actually for quite some time. We had to reschedule it because of a snow event earlier this month, I think it was. And we've been talking about doing this right around the time of the anniversary of the revolution in Tunisia. We wanted to have this event for two main reasons. One, to analyze an aspect of U.S. policy in the Middle East overall, the U.S. policy responses to the Arab Spring and the uprisings. As we all see, there's no shortage of assessments on the Iran nuclear deal or the Syrian civil war or the efforts to get peace between the Palestinians and Israelis. But it's important for us here, I wanted to say at the center, why this discussion is very important, because a core part of our research for about 4 or 5 years was doing a series of intense studies on the ground from 2011 to 2015 on the policy responses that produced a number of different reports based on research, in places like Tunisia, Jordan, Syria, and Egypt was a strong focus. And as we'll probably talk about, several years ago, CAP and the U.S. Institute for Peace actually had
Of peace. We're for peace.
Yeah, for peace. Thanks, Bill. Thanks. We actually had a quiet effort co-chaired by Steve Hadley and John Podesta in 2012, I think it was, to try to look at the policy response in Egypt. And in fact, Anne was part of some of those discussions while in government. I want to acknowledge, though, on this first objective, I want to acknowledge today that this panel does not include a voice from the region or the Middle East. And it is sort of a gap, and I think it's important to recognize that. The reason for it is we wanted to hone in on the U.S. policy responses. So we're honored to have 3 ambassadors who are on the front lines here. And we really, the first goal is to look at the strategic policy response to these transitions and wrestle with that and try to draw some lessons from it. The second reason why it was important for us here at CAP to have this discussion is to look to policy moving forward. Not just have a trip down memory lane here from 7 or 8 years, but really what I hope this conversation will do is draw lessons from that experience and apply it to all aspects of U.S. engagement in the Middle East, but with a focus on how do you elevate democracy and freedom and values, something that, in my view right now, is not a high priority in the current administration's policy, but I don't think those issues are going away in any case. And last year, our team here at CAP produced a paper called Securing a Democratic World, which was about a values-based approach to foreign policy. And the Middle East is probably the most complicated and challenging to this day. The sort of retrograde tendencies towards freedom and democracy that we see underway. And I think it's important to sort of examine this because my assessment is that these issues, the sort of structural factors that contributed to uprisings and Arab Spring, the crushing demographic, economic, and political pressures are still present in many of these countries. So we've got 3 great panelists. You've seen their bios. I'm not going to go through them extensively. My colleague, Ambassador Gordon Gray, was ambassador to Tunisia from 2009 to 2012. Next to Gordon is Ambassador Ann Patterson, who is America's ambassador to Egypt, 2011 to 2013. And last but not least, Bill Taylor, who was the special coordinator for the Office of Middle East Transitions at the State Department from 2011 to 2013. I'm going to start with Gordon. He was ambassador in Tunisia. And I have to tell you, the fact that Gordon is here in a sling, there's a story related to this. Gordon and I and a few other colleagues were in Muscat, Oman last week. And Gordon and I went for a run in the morning, first thing in the morning. And as I've done this before, but as happens, we were talking and Gordon tripped and fell and picked himself up, had a drink of water. We ran another mile or so, did a day full of meetings. And towards the end of the day, Gordon says to me, I think I'm going to go to the hospital. I'm going to get this checked out. Gordon broke his arm on our first day in Muscat, but he's stuck with the program. And I highlight that because I didn't know Gordon at the time when he was ambassador to Tunisia, but I imagine the way he conducted himself last week on the trip. When the unexpected comes up, he was pretty stoic about it, had a job to do, and went through it. And I wanted to start with you because you were in Tunisia when the protests started breaking out. and you saw the events unfold that were historic. And I thought maybe you could take us back to not only what you saw, but then give us your reflections on how you saw the U.S. policy response. What were some of the good things about how the U.S. responded? What were things that we could have done differently? And then the most important question, I think the overarching, is what lessons does this mean? How do we draw that forward to advice for the current administration and then future administrations moving forward? So Gordon, over to you.
Great. Well, thanks for that kind introduction, Brian. It's always good to get the sympathy factor from the audience, so I appreciate it. I think there were a lot of things that the United States did right in its response to what happened in Tunisia. And I'll mention maybe 5 of them. The first thing was something that the State Department had done well in advance, which was to invest in its people and really develop some expertise on North Africa in general, Middle East in general, but also on Tunisia. I'll give you a couple of specific examples. The Assistant Secretary at the time was Jeff Feltman. He had served as political economic counselor in Tunis from 1998 to 2000. He kept many of his contacts with civil society, and so he had a very good appreciation of Tunisia. We also had a number of people at the embassy who had studied Arabic at the field school, perhaps years before, perhaps before assuming their responsibilities. So they had a very good sense of the country as well, and I think that was extremely helpful. Second lesson I learned is the importance of U.S. leadership, and I think it's fair to say that the U.S. government was pretty fast on the mark in recognizing the opportunity that the revolution presented. Again, a few examples. Jeff Feltman was the first senior official to visit Tunisia after Ben Ali fled. He came just 10 days after that, and the Tunisians really noticed that. They particularly noticed that because there were there was an Arab minister who had scheduled a visit, and not to put too fine a point on it, I think was a little, the Tunisians perceived he was a little scared about the security situation, and he canceled. I remember a senior Tunisian telling me, we remember who our friends are. It wasn't just the executive branch. Senators Lieberman and McCain came in February. Secretary Clinton came in March. So there was a very strong U.S. official representation. And it may be too glib to say that 80% of success in life is showing up, but the opposite side of the coin is that if you don't show up, you're guaranteeing failure. Third, U.S. values are important, and it's important to articulate them. And I specifically recall 11 days after Ben Ali fled in the January 25th, 2011 State of the Union address, President Obama said that we stand with the Tunisian people and their aspirations for democracy. There was bipartisan support for that kind of obvious statement of U.S. values, standing ovation, everyone rose to their feet, et cetera. And that really made an impression on Tunisians. I had average Tunisians and ministers alike told me in almost identical words that it brought tears to their eyes. And more important than that, they said it gave us confidence that we were on the right path. Fourth, words are great. We all know that. We're in Washington. We traffic in words. But it's also extremely important to put your money where your mouth is. And the United States did that, and Bill Taylor deserves a great deal of the credit for that. And I'll let you speak a little bit more about that when we get. Or
blame.
Sorry?
Or blame.
Well, credit as far as Embassy Tunis was concerned. And then the fifth thing that I think we got right was recognizing that it was the Tunisian revolution, the Tunisians' revolution. It was their accomplishment. It wasn't our revolution. And in diplomacy, as in a lot of other things, a little bit of humility goes a long way. I think, well, three of us probably, not speaking for you two, but probably feel like we made a lot of recommendations, implemented a lot of good things, but I think at the same time, there are certain limits on how much influence the US government, even though we're a superpower, et cetera, can have. A few things on what we could have done better. One thing, since right after Ben Ali fled on January 14th, demonstrations started in Tahrir Square in Cairo, January 25th. Mubarak fled to Sharm el-Sheikh on February 11th. Libya, demonstrations in Libya, Bahrain, Syria, Yemen. I'm probably missing a few countries. So there were tremendous bandwidth problems in Washington. And as much expertise as we had in Washington, and as big as the bureaucracy was, there were limitations on the absorptive capacity. And this leads into my second observation on something I think the government could have done a lot better, which was that summer there was the sense that, well, we'll let Europe deal with North Africa. You'll remember Sarkozy was very forward-leaning on the Libya intervention. Certainly Egypt was a strategic prize, and there was a desire for the US to focus on that. I think what as wishful thinking often does, it overlooked two key factors. One was the Eurozone crisis, and the other was the fact that some of our close allies in Southern Europe had a bit of colonial baggage and had very closely embraced Ben Ali. Fortunately, we saw that change, and I would put the change around Labor Day, which happens to be when your office was created, Bill, but again, I'll let you speak about that. Third thing we could have done better is there's always, it's human nature. I certainly don't mean to be critical because I'm sure I've said it, but kind of what I would call Washingtonitis. The problem's too difficult, now's not the right time, don't rock the boat, et cetera. And then a fourth and final observation on what we could have done better was we could have been a lot more nimble in staffing. My former colleague from the State Department, David Green's in the audience, and we very much appreciated his assistance when he came from Embassy Rabat. But not all embassies were able to lend the same kind of support. So as far as lessons learned, to answer that question, Brian, most of them flow from my observations, so I won't go over in great detail. One is it's definitely important to develop the expertise, invest fully in people and staff adequately. That was an issue pre 9/11. I saw it in smaller scope in Tunisia. I think it's an issue today for this administration, particularly after then Secretary Tillerson's drastic budget cuts. Second lesson learned is U.S. leadership is very important. I would say that, to paraphrase Mark Twain, rumors of our demise are greatly exaggerated. We've got a lot of influence. We shouldn't be afraid to use it. That flows into a third observation, which I think dovetails with something you said, Brian, which is our democratic values have earned global respect, and it's important that we reinforce those. The fourth lesson, which I mentioned, is, like I said, just as applicable then as it is today and in the future as it was then, is the importance of humility and the recognition of our limits. The fifth Fifth lesson is working closely with partners. I'm very pleased that Ambassador Goya is in the audience. At the time, he was senior official at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He had responsibility for the Americas and Asia, but we only let him work on the United States, as I recall. And he was a terrific partner in achieving what we wanted to achieve, as was Tunisian civil society. That's very important. And then the last lesson I learned, which I would advise for the future folks, this is a little more for practitioners, not quite as lofty maybe. One is, if you're in the field, be imaginative, propose solutions, take the initiative. And then the second is the importance of visits. Having people come and being able to lobby them was really helpful. And I'll give a specific example. Today is the 8th year anniversary of a cable that we sent to Washington suggesting funding for Tunisia via OPIC, creation of a Peace Corps program, and also recommending that Tunisia be deemed eligible for the Millennium Challenge Corporation. Not to put too fine a point on it, we could hear across the Atlantic even our friends laughing at us. But then we got a lot of visits, and the president invited the then Prime Minister, current President, Bejicaia Essebsi, for an Oval Office meeting, and all of a sudden those crazy proposals became deliverables, the greatest word in Washington, and they were announced from the Oval Office. So I'll end there and look forward to hearing what the two of you have to say.
Yeah, that's a great way to kick us off here. And we were talking earlier this morning, actually, on our team, on the national security team, about the broader issue of how do you elevate diplomacy and development. And if you remember, about 10 years ago or more, there was this smart power revolution that people sort of woke up and realized after the Iraq War that we were investing far too much in our military and that we needed to do more to elevate diplomacy. And as you all experienced to some degree, there were the QDDRs, the Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Reviews, 1.0 and 2.0. And one thing I wanted to mention at the outset, but I do think the discussion and the response to it really was one of the tests of that idea of smart power. How do you actually innovate? How do you invest in the resources in the State Department and in the civilian sides of government to really have an impact? And obviously, Tunisia to this day is still seen as a shining example of how that went. Mm-hmm. Egypt is a different case, as we know, for complicated reasons. And Anne, I didn't have time. I mean, all of your biographies are tremendous. And I think I first met Ambassador Patterson when she was ambassador to Pakistan a long while ago, in the previous decade. And when she was preparing, you weren't there during the first days of the revolution in Egypt. But I'll never forget this. When she was preparing to go out there, she came to each of the individual think tanks, including the Center for American Progress. We were doing a lot of work. And instead of calling us in to Foggy Bottom, like a lot of people do, she came to us and actually had in-depth discussions and was really interested in trying to understand the different perspectives from the analysts. And that meant a lot, I think, to a lot of people. And that connection, I hope the work that we produce in some way was helpful while you were in the job. So Egypt's much more complicated, and it's much grimmer these days, obviously. So would love to hear your perspective on it.
Well, thank you, Brian, and thank you. I think it's very useful to look at the policy tools we have available. But vis-a-vis Egypt, I want to make 3 general points before I talk about the tools. It had a lot of impact on the democratic process. The first is obvious, but U.S. policy toward Egypt has been relentlessly consistent for decades, and it's all about maintaining peace with Israel. Yes, there have been ups and downs and democratic initiatives, et cetera, but when push comes to shove, these all took a backseat to good relations with Israel, and that's important to remember as this process went forward. The second is a rather obvious preeminent role of the Egyptian military. The Egyptian military got rid of Mubarak, they got rid of Morsi, and if anyone gets rid of al-Sisi, it'll be the Egyptian military. It wasn't the democratic process. And then third, finally, I'm very interested in having this conversation because I think some of us in international community have not focused on what happens when the democratic tradition brings forward results we don't like. It's sort of like religious freedom. If we get religious freedom, everybody's going to be a Presbyterian. It was obvious from the beginning that the Brotherhood was going to do well in Egypt. The surprise was the Salafis. But let's remember that the Islamists won 72% of the first election in Egypt. And a lot of it was highly predictable. But let me talk about the tools. The first tool is the one that Gordon mentioned, which is the American capacity to engage a wide range of actors and to have a lot of information because of our intelligence operations, et cetera. This was really not a problem in Egypt, but there were gaps. We had a good, excellent staff, and we had very good information. The one gap, serious gap that we had was the involvement of the Gulf countries in removing Morsi. We had almost 100% visibility on the coup. We didn't understand really the role of the Salafis because we hadn't been in contact with them, but we tried to redress that. I'm extremely concerned that we've become too risk averse in the Middle East and we're going to have huge knowledge gaps in the future, but that's a different discussion. Second, the U.S. has financial resources at its disposal, but these are a lot less than people think they are. By the time I got to Egypt, civilian assistance had dwindled considerably. We tried to use it as a lever, but holding back a few $1 million in a country that needs billions is not only ineffective but insulting. So that was not a very effective lever. Military assistance, which has been much written about in the think tank community, yes, that's a more effective lever. It was $1.3 billion a year. We had allowed this over the years to basically fund expensive co-production efforts with tanks and trucks and things like that they could sell commercially. And I certainly deserve a lot of responsibility for letting this go on. What we should have done, and I was not in favor of cutting off assistance, we should have forced them to drive this military assistance into making themselves a more effective army. Keep in mind that $45 billion has gone into the Egyptian military, and when push came to shove, they couldn't defeat 1,000 insurgents in the Sinai without Israeli help. And why does this matter? Because a military that's more focused on professionalization is a lot less likely to be going after dissidents in their own country. Their intelligence operation looks outward, et cetera. They were incredibly impressive officers in the Egyptian military, but over time they had become sort of a rentier class. And then we have moral suasion, and there's been much written about this, and this is usually what people talk about when they say that we don't speak out about human rights or we don't cajole leaders. We have an outsized ability, of course, to name and shame. And finally, I want to sort of drill into this. We have programs that promote democracy in a practical way, IRI, NDI, and IFAS. We put $40 million into IRI and NDI when I first got there, and as many of you in this room knows, it certainly wasn't successful and the policy backfired. And it wasn't resolved until I think November or December of last year. This came to dominate our bilateral relationship and affect many other elements of it. So here's where we made a mistake, I think, on this. I used to spend a huge amount of time with generals trying to convince them that these organizations were benign. But the decision to move IRI and NDI outside of Cairo, where of course they could be easily monitored by security forces, into the hinterland, in retrospect, was a red line. And I also came to realize that ordinary Egyptians oppose these organizations because they found it somewhat offensive that in their 7,000-year-old society, a bunch of foreigners would sort of parachute in and talk to them about democracy and how to establish their political system. In our minds, too, these groups took on sort of iconic status, and they weren't just a bunch of useful courses like I think we perceive them in Latin America. So in retrospect, I think it would have been better to concentrate on the mechanics through groups like IFAS and then support civil society, maybe non-political civil society groups more directly. A related question, I think, is whether we made a mistake when Mubarak fell by not delaying the democratic process. In other words, giving chance for the secular parties to organize and promote candidates. And obviously over the years I've thought a lot about this. And given the enormous disruption and labor unrest, that was also something you didn't notice unless you were on the ground, was a very widespread labor unrest. I actually don't think we had much choice but to push forward. It was just an unsustainable situation. And then finally, did the U.S. do enough to press Morsi to be a more democratic leader, and would it have made any difference? My own view was that the problem with Morsi was not that he was an Islamic extremist, but he simply didn't know what he was doing. And by the time he became under pressure, he began to sort of collapse with a group of very isolated and frankly inexperienced advisors. Many in the U.S. government got fed up with him because he was arrogant and incompetent and isolated and resistant to advice. Could we have influenced him more effectively? That's a good question. I'd love to hear what the audience said. And then finally, I want to talk about the tools we don't use. What we have become very enthusiastic in recent years about using the stick side of markets. We're great with sanctions, we're great with cutting people, financial sanctions, cutting them off for our banking system. But we've retreated from the carrot part of this, which is using access as our market to an incentive for good behavior. Trade agenda in the Middle East collapsed about 2004. The first Bush administration did a lot of good things, but it was never really revived for good reason in some respects. But promoting democracy and free markets used to go hand in hand, and we've sort of forgotten the free market element of this, and I think that's a big mistake. So I'll stop there.
Great, that was excellent, and thank you so much. And Bill, last but not least, you have not only the benefit of this position in the Office of Middle East Transitions, but then, well, all of you do, but the comparative experience in Ukraine and Central and Eastern Europe. But how do you see it? And maybe take us, we looked at Tunisia and Egypt in sort of a granular way. How did you see sort of the response across the region? What sort of challenges were you facing back here?
Thanks, Brian. So, back in Washington, these guys are in the field, I'm back in Washington, partway through, given the privilege of coordinating the Washington side of the assistance to 4 countries, actually. So I was responsible for Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, and Syria. And I was 1 for 3. The Tunisians did well. The others, not so much. But what we did right, right at the outset, when I arrived, which, as Gordon said, was kind of the summer, and we opened up the office in the early fall of 2011, the Secretary of State was very supportive. She was focused on this, and full support she had. To whatever you need, she told me, we can do this. And her deputy, Bill Burns, was willing to spend a lot of time. Within the State Department and broader in the interagency, we established a task force, and we met regularly, every week. And Bill Burns, to his credit, chaired those meetings right at the outset. He chaired, and when the Deputy Secretary of State chairs a meeting, people show up, and people come prepared, and people think about options and are creative, and it was good. That really got us started. So that organization, I think, was great. Just on Secretary Clinton, actually, I remember one time when she was flying out of Tunis. She was on her airplane, and we got a call from the airplane saying, it wasn't to me, I think it was probably to Bill or to Cheryl or somebody, that was say, tell those guys in that office of transitions that I want $100 million in cash transfer for Tunisia. Now,
Sorry about that, but
not a bit, Gordon, not a bit, because if I had gone to the organization, the F Bureau, the Foreign Assistance Bureau, and said, I'd really like $100 million for Tunisia, I'd have been laughed out of the building. But when the Secretary of State calls and says, we made it happen, and I think the ambassador predecessor signed for this not many weeks later. So that kind of support was extremely valuable. That said, in order to find that $100 million, in order to find other support, we had to raid other accounts. That is, there were no new funds appropriated for this. There were accounts that we could go to, and the F Bureau, the Foreign Assistance Bureau in the State Department, was creative in trying to find funds for this thing, but it was constrained. You know, it was constrained. It was hard to do. And there was also, Brian, you asked about other experiences. When the Soviet Union disappeared, you know, so go all the way back to 1991, 1992. When the Soviet Union disappeared, the Congress, with full support from the administration, established an office with a coordinator, and more important than that, much more important than that, they gave this coordinator budget authority. They gave him a budget and the ability to allocate that money. So that was not done in the Arab Spring situation. So that was one thing that, you know, could have been done differently, had been done differently earlier on, and I think was more effective in that regard. One of the other things that people will remember, we talked about the international response, was the Deauville process.
Yeah.
Who was responsible for this? This was all done by the time I arrived, but Deauville is now a bad word in the Arab Spring countries because it was a big meeting of international financial institutions and bilateral donors in a French city that came up with, I think, $28 billion. I mean, enormous number.
Ridiculous.
That was never going to happen because these were promises and these were possibilities and these were loan guarantees and it was apples and oranges. But the countries of Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, and Syria, they didn't realize that it was not serious, and they kind of took us seriously. They said, well, okay, good, we'll do some things. Where's the money? And there wasn't. So that was a disappointment. We ought to keep that in mind. Last thing on the assistance side, on the directly assistance side, in moving some money around, Anne was actually instrumental in identifying a lot of money that had been appropriated earlier on that was in the pipeline, that hadn't been spent in Egypt. It was clearly going to be spent in Egypt, so we had that, and it was about $500 million. It was a big chunk of money. And we didn't want to go to IRI and NDI for the reasons that Anne just described. And we did want to go to the people. So we had designed a very ambitious exchange program, not even an exchange program, a scholarship program for young Egyptians to come study here, come study in other parts of the Middle East, and study within Egypt. There were different components. And we'd assembled, as I say, by moving things around, $500 million. This was going to be a significant contribution, I thought. And the exchange programs and this kind of scholarship program, I think, are the most effective. So we did a little bit of that, as the Tunisians know, on the, I think, Thomas Jefferson,
yeah.
The Jefferson scholarships we did in a smaller amount, but they continue. Those are really effective programs. Those are really effective democracy programs, social coherence programs. These are very good. And so we were ready. We had cranked this up in the spring of 2012. Is that right?
I thought it was later. Maybe.
No, you're right. It was 2013. You're exactly right. In the spring of 2013, because that's when you know the punchline here. All through June, the interagency worked real hard, and we had to figure out how we were going to do this, and it helped identify the money to do this. And we even had the president tape, or was about to tape, a message to all these Egyptians. We're going to play it both here and all across Egypt, saying $500 million for exchanges, and then the coup. So that stopped it in its tracks. The coup. As Anne indicated, this had a real effect on the assistance that we were planning to provide, not just this half a billion dollars for exchanges or scholarships, but all of the other assistance, including the military assistance. It affected it because there's legislation. Most people in this room realize that there's legislation that says if there is a coup in a country, the assistance from the United States gets cut off. You cut off the assistance. So we tied ourselves in knots back in Washington. trying to avoid saying this was a coup. We had these weird ways of saying what was going on out there. But we didn't say, we didn't want to, somebody didn't want. I mean, there were people saying this is a coup, but there were a lot of other people higher than those people saying this is not a coup. Because we want to continue this assistance, in particular to the military, in particular because it's a strategic partnership, in particular because of the relationship with Israel, all the reasons that Ann mentioned. Because it was a coup, the lawyers told us, you gotta kind of scale back this assistance because it's really a coup. Even when we can't say that, it was a coup. And so it tied us in knots, suffice to say. Last thing I will say is that about the coup. And there's been a lot of reporting, a lot of studies, a lot of conversations about democracy in Egypt. And maybe democracy in the Middle East. So the United States, in this instance, decided we weren't going to oppose the coup. We shifted our support. Even though we tried to get Morsi to do things differently, and we sent the Secretary of Defense over to give him some encouragement. Secretary of Defense didn't quite do it right. Didn't pass the message that you need to make some changes here. I think the president made a call. But then in the end, these other strategic considerations came in and say, well, it's not a coup, so we're going to support the military. We supported the military, and now, as Brian has indicated, today, Egypt is passing laws and maybe even constitutional changes that allows the president, who took over in the coup, to be president for life. This is not so good. This is not a good signal for democracy in the Middle East. And we, and not this administration, this is the previous administration, had something to do with that. Maybe I should stop there.
That's really great. And I want to, what we're going to do is have a conversation for a little bit here and then open it up to you, any questions, and engage you in a little bit. I wanted to ask a question first back in the moment, just so that we can move forward and get to the questions of what would you advise the current or future administrations on these issues. But when you think about the broad brush, and there's so many areas we could take this, even just on Egypt or Tunisia, but I want to take a step back and look at the region writ large and America's engagement with the region at that time, from 2011 more or less to 2014. And I think you would all agree that we did not meet our hopes and aspirations for supporting Middle East transitions, writ large. Maybe Tunisia was better. Both of you and I agree with it, that Egypt is probably in a worse state. What are the reasons for that? When you think, what are the biggest reasons as to why the U.S. policy responses fell short? Was it because of the lack of a strategic argument, I think, as you indicated, in Central and Eastern Europe? At the end of the Cold War, there was a broadly shared, understood rationale for supporting transitions and bringing these countries sort of quote unquote into the West. Was it the absence of that, and also you were serving a president who essentially was elected president to get out of the Iraq War and the Middle East, and we had a decade of high costs, more or less, by then, of our engagement in the region. Was it that? Or was it some of the things, Ann, you alluded to, the complicated politics within the countries or within the region itself, that America shouldn't pretend to be imperialists. We need to recognize this, as Gordon said, humility is important, that people write their own histories. And at least the way I see it, inside of Egypt, but then inside of the region, there was this complicated struggle for power and influence that was hard for Americans, including people like you on the front lines, to really assess what were the other plays that were being called by actors inside of Egypt or inside of the region, offering support to different factions. But the central question, you understand it, is why did we come up short from writ large? Was it also Libya and the horrible death of Ambassador Stevens, and then how that was politicized? Was it the Syrian civil war taking a turn in the wrong direction. When you, sort of at the most strategic level, when you think about the U.S. response to this, we fell short, unless you disagree with that. Why was that, is the question.
I'll take an initial stab at it. I think, excuse me, I think one of the reasons I think you identified some of the reasons we fell short. Fatigue with involvement in the Middle East in general, multiple foreign policy challenges or even crises. Ambassador Stevens's death became highly politicized, unfortunately. I'd just add one other factor, which is contrasting it with how we responded after the Cold War, or after the wall fell and the Soviet Union fell apart. Then we had a president who was keenly interested in foreign policy, very experienced, and had a strategic vision of how to move ahead. And also, we had very strong partners in the sense of strong European multilateral institutions, NATO, the European Union. And so there were good partners and good models. And I think that's one of the things that was lacking in the Middle East, because some of our partners who we had very good partnerships with on certain issues, i.e. Gulf countries on military, weren't exactly the strongest partners as far as democratization, as you've alluded to.
Brian, I think it was just flat too hard. And one of the issues was, by this point, there was basically a great fatigue with the Middle East. When I left Pakistan, we were spending $10 billion a month in Afghanistan. And there was concern about the resources that would have had to go into this region to help. Keep in mind, the Gulf countries put $20 billion into Egypt, $20 billion into a matter of weeks after Morsi was removed to support al-Sisi. And we'd spend hours arguing over the disposition of a few $100 million. We should have supported Tunisia with a lot more resources. I would say that to this day, but it wasn't just about resources. As Gordon said, there was a shortage of bandwidth too. There were too many things going on at once. And then these countries are not Eastern Europe. They don't have the educational levels. They have vast, complicated demographic problems. It was just flat too hard.
Yeah. And Bill, I'd like to hear your response as well. But one thing, if I recall correctly, the efforts to get funding for the Office of Middle East Transitions was also extremely hard in a budget context where we had surged in Afghanistan. There were so many things going on back here, and I think also the 2012 elections, at least early on, was part of sort of the Washington milieu. Was it? Do I recall that correctly? It was hard for you to just get basic support beyond sort of what you were able to find, the found money that you discussed and found for Egypt and things like this?
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. No, the budget situation was so different in 2011, 2012, compared to 1992, 1993, and through the 90s. I mean, there were billions of dollars appropriated every year for the force to get the former Soviet states to be democratic and market-oriented, and that motivated. I mean, I think both Gordon and Ann have indicated there were policy principles, there were values that we were serving in the former Soviet when we were trying to support the former Soviet Union, and in some sense, while it was really hard, as Ann says, I mean, if we had let, if the Egyptians had let, and the international community had supported our principles, our values, which is you listen to the elections. People vote, and if they screw up, and as Ann says, the guy wasn't, he was just incompetent. He was a bad leader. Morsi was just, he said things that, his, his decrees took a higher status than the parliament, or some crazy thing. It was really bad. Mm-hmm. However, he's elected. He probably wouldn't have been reelected. There were, as Ann just indicated, there was the support from the outside, support from the Saudis and the Emiratis, and maybe we have representatives here, for the opposition to Morsi that flooded the streets and made us think, oh my goodness, this is a popular revolution against this guy, and so maybe we should support. It was just hard to hold on to those principles.
Yeah, great.
Let me give you a bandwidth example on the trade side. I don't mean to keep coming back to this. So there were a number of opportunities, as again, Tunisia or Egypt, where we could have done more on trade. And so, but the administration, in my view, correctly had other priorities. Asia and Europe, these huge markets for American firms. And we go talk to the trade people and they'd say, these are huge markets for American firms and we don't want to complicate our congressional relations by dragging in countries like Egypt. And I get that. But it was a question of both prioritization and bandwidth that we didn't go down that route.
Yeah, yeah, and you even tried, I think, to bring delegations out, including Mike Froman and the private sector as well. But my sense was that these bigger strategic plays of trying to tie our aid and our assistance to connections to with the IMF and others, but then trying to put something together, it was just hard to make that a priority back here, back to the bandwidth issue.
No, and Asia's a huge market. I get that.
Yeah, great. So here we are in early 2019, and this is where we really wanted to take the discussion and all of the lessons that you've offered, lessons learned, both the good things that were done at the time and then things that could have been done differently. And this is my view. You may or may not share it. I said it before. These issues of transition and supporting democracy in the Middle East aren't a priority of this current administration. If you read Secretary Mike Pompeo's speech in Cairo, and it's no coincidence he chose Cairo, there was very little in there, I think, that looked at reform. Today, as we're having this panel, he's in Poland, and they're talking mostly, I think, on a regional security issue with a heavy focus on countering Iran and competing with Iran in the region. So I recognize my question is a bit academic, maybe today, or maybe you disagree with it. But if you were to advise people who are thinking about the next 5 to 10 years of U.S. policy, and if you agree with my premise earlier on, that these transitions are either incomplete, even though there's been great progress in Tunisia, there's a lot of work to be done, or they've gone backwards. And the premise that they're not likely to end because of the structural factors, what are the things you would advise? Either the current administration, if it sort of had a wake-up moment and wanted to prioritize these issues, or a next administration that said, as CAP has said in its recent report, we want to place greater focus on supporting transitions. What would you do? I mean, you had some lessons from the experience in Egypt, but what would you say now as it relates to the broader Middle East? And I know each country is different, but what are the main sort of pieces of recommendation you would offer about how to be effective and pragmatic in this?
So I'd focus on the mechanics for a while.
Right.
I think we did a pretty good job of that. I hate to speak about Tunisia while Gordon and the ambassador, but I think we did a pretty good job of helping the Tunisians sort of shore up their infrastructure. And that's something that most countries will buy into. And it's important. It's not obviously a game changer, but over time it makes a difference. And I doubt that this would be acceptable even in Egypt today, but there are certainly places like Jordan and Lebanon and Kuwait that we could do this sort of thing. So that, I think, is sort of an entry-level issue. Groups like IFAS do a good job. And then you do need to speak out. I mean, what are we going to say about the extension of President al-Sisi to 2034 or whatever it happens to be? Obviously, it's not going to roll that back. So that's where I'd start, would be the mechanics. And I think in all these countries, given the current situation, you need to be pretty low-key about it. Because as I say, one of the big eye-openers to me was how, and it wasn't just a propaganda war, how the Egyptian public was resistant to some of this interference too.
Gordon? Bill?
I'll steal from something you said, Bill, and something you said, Ann. I think it's, Bill, you talking about post-Cold War situation. It's really important to have a strategic vision and enunciate what it is, and then follow through, not just rhetorically, but also with the mechanics and also with the funding. So I don't see that in the current administration, but I think the next administration, regardless of what flavor it is that would be the first piece of unsolicited advice I'd give it. And then the second one, I agree completely with what you said about keeping it low key and remembering what we can do and how we can be most effective.
So a small one and a big one. The small one is what Ann said about carrots. We've been talking about a free trade agreement with Tunisia since I was there. And it's been brought up over and over and over. This can't be that hard. This can't be that hard. I mean, this is, and this would send a great signal. If we want to help the Tunisian economy, which we do, this would be something that is just not that, it's not expensive. It takes a little time from from part of the bureaucracy, but we could do this. So that would be one. The bigger one I would say is our influence in the world is because we have an operating democracy that is true to principles, that believes in certain values, and that's more powerful, I think, than any of the pieces of our foreign policy or our assistance policy it could otherwise be. And so we need some work here. We obviously need to recommit to that, but we also need to recommit to the principle of kind of democratic transitions, democratic principles in other countries in a low-key way. I mean, this cannot be. Ann's exactly right. We can't go in preaching. Mm-hmm. We have to demonstrate it. We have to support it in ways that are at the mechanic level, at the fundamental level. But we need to stick with that.
Right. My last question, and we'll open it up, is this issue of spoilers, if you will, in the region. Those actors that were throwing their money and their weight around today. If you wanted to reprioritize in a place like Egypt, or I think the role of these countries in places like Libya is obvious, and then we're sitting here where the main debate in Washington, or one of the main debates, is Saudi Arabia and the UAE's intervention in Yemen and what to do about that next. As diplomats, as former diplomats, how would you navigate that? The effort of trying to actually re-inject quietly and with humility the principle of democracy and support for these countries. But then how do you talk to those countries that actually are much more assertive or aggressive, whatever word you want to use, in throwing their weight around? Is there a way to navigate it, or do you just try to avoid it? I mean, what do you think?
Well, let's be candid. These countries all live very satisfactorily under the U.S. defense umbrella. We have bases in Kuwait, we have bases in Bahrain, we have bases in Qatar, and they protect the economic lifeline of all these countries. And so it shouldn't be that difficult to make them come a little our way on some of these issues.
Right. So you're implying use the leverage of our security umbrella.
And that's really pretty serious leverage.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if the American Navy wasn't in the Bab el-Mandab and the Straits of Hormuz, it could be bad news.
And given your experience working the interagency and with the Pentagon and others, how hard is it to move the U.S. government itself towards those tools?
Not that difficult.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you got leadership, from the, I mean, they do what the president tells them to do.
If the president says it. Yeah.
Or the Congress. I mean, we've seen recently that the Congress can intervene in these things.
In the case of Yemen.
In the case of Yemen and Saudi Arabia and Emirates. So there are ways that our system of government can push us in that direction.
Okay, we're going to open up to the audience.
All right.
So do us a favor, tell us who you are. If you've got an affiliation, share that as well, and make it a question. We've got a good bit of time, and if you want to direct your question to a particular panelist, that'd be great. Red tie. Yeah.
Hi, it's Dana Marshall with Transnational Strategy Group. Brian, thanks for setting this up. There's a lot of questions that come to mind for any of us who've been practitioners in this, but I wanted to sort of ask the panel a different kind of question, not so much the U.S. role, but no conversation like this today could be complete without talking about what China's doing. I wonder if there could be an analysis of what they're doing They certainly have no restraints or constraints on their ability to indebt countries that they're involved in. What sort of objectives are they pursuing? How effective are they? Is there any scope for us being able to collaborate? Are they conflicts between what we're trying to do, what we have been trying to do at least traditionally, and what they're trying to do? I just want to sort of have a spotlight into that.
Who wants to take China?
I can take it because the Chinese were not very active in Tunisia. I think the Tunisians had, and I hesitate to speak with the ambassador here, but at least when I was in Tunisia, right before I got there, there was some serious unrest between Algerians and Chinese workers. I think the Tunisians are savvy enough to realize that Chinese assistance comes with a great deal of strings, and one of those strings is the need to use Chinese labor. And one of the big economic challenges for Tunisia is employment. So bringing in the Chinese doesn't really help.
Yeah, I think that's right, Dana. The Chinese weren't very active in Egypt. I hear they're all over the Gulf now, but in an economic sense, with money and with business and of course with the vacuum of U.S. leadership in many of these places now, and the lack of ambassadors in something like 6 major Middle Eastern countries, there's a vacuum for the Chinese to go into, and the Russians as well, for that matter.
Yeah, if I could add something, in the spring of 2015, we had a CAP delegation in Beijing talking mostly about climate, but I was there because we were talking about U.S.-China cooperation in the Middle East, and we produced a report actually that summer and did a panel on it. And we were there at a time when the Yemen war, when Saudi Arabia and the UAE launched the Yemen war, and I was seated next to a Chinese general. And I asked her, I said, what's your country going to do? She said, we're getting out. We're getting all of our citizens out like we did in Libya. We don't want to expose ourselves to the sorts of problems your country has had, or Japan that spring had, I think, an aid worker or journalist kidnapped in Iraq. And when it calms down, then maybe our Belt and Road idea, we can see what happens in places like this. In Egypt, in the last year or two, what I've noted in tracking sort of the economic developments in Egypt, the U.S. is not really all that present there. I mean, we have delegations and things like this, but China really has upped its game in infrastructure investment and the sort of what I think are rapacious tools that we've seen in Pakistan. Pakistan having a lot of problem with debt and other things. So it's, to me, not a model of sustainable development, but I still think, going back to these conversations we had in 2015, it's still one worth having between the U.S. and China, because when you look at, and I'm sorry as the moderator to go on this, but I think it's an important point, when you look at the appetite here in the United States for helping these countries help themselves, or thinking about the enormity of reconstructing Yemen or Syria over the next decade, it's really going to be a team effort. It's certainly not going to be paid for by U.S. taxpayers. But how do you then, build an international consensus to help these countries help themselves, I think, is a key question. Over here, I'll go back and forth. Ma'am, back there. Yeah.
All the discussion of military, Jane Zimmerman. With all the discussion of military assistance and trade and economic assistance, I was wondering how you see the role of policing, keeping in mind that police often are the cause of popular grievances against regimes, and the Arab Spring kind of started with a policeman and a vegetable seller.
I agree with the implicit premise of your question, and I know we did have some programs with the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement at the State Department to help work on community policing and things like that.
So in Egypt, we could never, yes, of course, it's hugely important, because this was, as you point out, was the catalyst for much of the Arab Spring, and the police were vastly more inclined to engage in human rights abuses as the military. We could never get past some of the human rights restrictions to do a very comprehensive police program, even if we had the money.
And the work with the Tunisian police continues. At the Institute of Peace, we're doing some things for INL on the Tunisian police, the National Guard. So it's identified as a really important component.
Marina.
Out away with the Wilson Center. When you were talking about, could we have done something different? Could you have done something different? I mean, the United States. Particularly in the case of Egypt, one question that comes to mind is, was there anybody you could have worked with? Because it seems to me that the military was not terribly receptive, certainly. The political parties, other than the Muslim Brothers and the Salafis, were practically non-existent. I remember a report written by John Alterman, I think, at CSIS, who went as an election observer. And he reported that he had not seen a single party office anywhere in Upper Egypt, other than the Muslim Brothers and the Salafis. So that essentially, the case of Tunisia was very different because we're all sort of organization and individuals and so on. But was there anybody in Egypt?
Well, we were trying to work with the Muslim Brotherhood, and I totally agree with you. And we were trying to work with the Salafis too, and they were the only organized force. The Brotherhood was really the only organized force. You would see them mobilize these trucks full of women in covered from head to toe in black. You would see them as poll watchers. They had an organization that just wouldn't stop. And the secular parties, there just wasn't anything there. There was there was the WAFT, and they had some kind of structure, those sort of, but nothing to compete with the Brotherhood and the Salafis, and essentially their grassroots support. So there was really nobody else to work with in a systematic way other than those parties and the military. And a lot of people, I think, had an exaggerated view of the range of the secular parties because they'd seen a lot of these young people in particular on TV. But once you picked off the young person, there really wasn't much beneath them, as Alterman said in his report.
And in terms of I wanted to ask you on Egypt, I'm interested in this. In 2012, when people were doing assessments, including you, and trying to understand the political landscape, but including the military, the Egyptian military itself, it understood this dynamic, the strength of the Muslim Brotherhood. No, I mean, David Kirkpatrick has written about this as well.
And then General al-Sisi was actually the liaison with the Muslim Brotherhood in the run-up to the election, so he knew very well what the pros and cons of the Muslim Brotherhood were. Of course, they understood it. It was their country. They understood it very well.
I mean, I guess the point I'm trying to stress is that some people point to the U.S. and your role as the ambassador and others as making some sort of decisions or placing bets on different actors, but they were actors inside of the country themselves, right?
Of course, of course. No, the military understood the dynamic well, and they thought they could work with the Brotherhood, at least at that early point.
Yeah.
The Brotherhood named Sisi as their Minister of Defense, right?
Yes.
I heard about that, yeah.
Yeah, and Gordon, you didn't experience, as Marina you had a much different landscape.
We had a much different landscape, and also there was just a different approach. One of the things that struck me on January 15th, 2011, and this is having served from 2002 to 2005 in Cairo. One of the first things that then Prime Minister / interim president / acting president Ghannouchi said, not Rashid Ghannouchi, was that we're going to hold elections and we're going to have international observation. And I never heard that statement in Cairo, either when I was there from 2002 to 2005 or 2011 on. And so it was just a different mindset about Tunisians really wanted to have free and fair elections. They wanted international observations, and so they were more than open to working with, be it NDI or IRI or IFIS or European counterparts. And there were lots of Tunisian NGOs that sprung up too.
And one of your big lessons is to be attuned to that different environment,
Yeah, yeah.
that don't push things too far so that it provokes some sort of backlash. That's how you saw the NGO case that was just resolved last. Yeah, great. All right, next question. Down front here.
The question way in the back.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you very much for all the panel. Very interesting. But I'll just focus on Ambassador Patterson. I'm with the Center for Egyptian-American Relations, and as you know, there are probably between 500,000 to 1 million Egyptian-Americans in this country. And they flooded me when they knew that I'm attending here with questions to you, Madam. And first of all, I heard I was not there, but I heard a great deal of compliment and praise for you and how much you took during those 2 years. So I have to at least thank you first. But I'll give headlines. And you can choose whatever. One is why Ambassador Patterson has been silent until now. We hear, for instance, in Kirkpatrick book, things on your own, and we want to hear from you because we are not sure whether his reflections or collections the same as you. For instance, one very important thing that you were the first or the only person who raised a maybe yellow flag about the appointment of General Sisi and you sent that to Washington. Another thing, of course, is we want to know you were in the negotiation with 2 Arab ministers and Sisi and Khairat Shatter and so on, who were cooperating with you and whom you think were not. The last thing here is I'm sure I heard at least from some ambassadors, former ambassadors, I got to know them in this country, and they said that the last stop before you leave to your appointment is usually with the president. What did President Obama had in his mind to you before you left to Egypt, and how much you think you achieved? Thanks.
So a deep dive on Egypt, Anne.
Well, it seems to me I talk about Egypt a lot, but let me let me say that I knew General al-Sisi well. I went back and a couple years later with Secretary Kerry, and we went to call on then President al-Sisi, and he said Ambassador Ann saw me 32 times in the 2 years. That sounded like a lot to me, but I saw him a lot. And I knew him very well, so yes, I did think that President Morsi had, and I think my words were, had bitten off more than he could chew when he elevated General al-Sisi to the head of the Minister of Defense, I think. So yes, that's true. Keep in mind too, I think that the military was not opposed in many respects to removing then Field Marshal Tintawi from office. He had been the head of the Egyptian military since General Mattis had been a captain at CENTCOM. So he had been in charge for quite a while, and I think there was a broad feeling in the military that it was time for him to move on and create headroom for other military officers to move up. And yes, of course, we met with people like Khairat al-Shatter all the time, and Katatni and other members of the Muslim Brotherhood. That was our job. I mean, they were the party in power, so of course we met with them all the time. And I'm not totally clear about what negotiation with Arab leaders you're talking about, but certainly in the aftermath of the coup, there was much involvement by Secretary Perry, by some of the Gulf leaders. Bill Burns came out there for quite a while and tried to work some arrangement between the government, the interim government, and the Muslim Brotherhood. It did not succeed. And I did not talk to President Obama right before I went out, and that is customary, and I don't recall why it didn't happen. I talked to President Bush before I went out to Pakistan. But our policy was really quite clear in Egypt. I mean, there seems to be our policy was to move forward with the democratic transition as best we could. Keeping in mind the point I raised first here, that a very important strategic consideration vis-a-vis Egypt is relations with Israel. And sometimes the two may be in conflict. So it wasn't that there was confusion about what we were supposed to do in our policy. It was actually pretty crystal clear.
Wow, the hallmark of a good discussion. You said there was somebody in the back?
All the way in the back.
All the way in the back, yeah. Well, I don't know if...
I did that.
Yeah. We've got some time, so if you bear with us, this is a great discussion.
Thank you. Well, congratulations for the great attendance. I mean, we're sitting out there because we couldn't find a space here. Excellent discussion. Munjid Dawadi previously from the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy. My question is about Tunisia, and I think all of you agreed, and you mentioned it in your discussion, that we should have supported Tunisia more. So I assume that you still think that the U.S. now should support Tunisia more. What would be your selling point to the Trump administration? Because they don't seem to be interested in that. What would be the thing that we should maybe tell them as advocates for increase of support to Tunisia?
So I get the easy question. I don't see this administration as being particularly interested in the points I would make to another administration as far as the, so I'll give you the points I'd make to a different administration, which would be the demonstration effect is extremely important. When Senator McCain came to Tunisia right after the revolutions, one of the things he said is, if it doesn't succeed here, it's not going to succeed anywhere. I think that's important. I think it's consistent with our values. I think we could, and this is something I felt when I was there and continue to feel, we can help the Tunisians in their transition at a relatively modest cost to the United States. And Bill mentioned a free trade agreement, which is something we both unsuccessfully advocated
so far,
enthusiastically,
but we haven't given up.
But I mean, that's a prime example. I mean, there's not, to my knowledge, there's not a big domestic olive oil constituency here that's going to oppose that. So I think there's lots of things we can do that would promote both U.S. interests, but also looking outside of Tunisia, U.S. National interests as well, and certainly encourage the current administration as well, but I think it's a little more transactional.
The only thing I'd add to Gordon's point is that this administration apparently doesn't like multilateral trade,
right,
but they like bilateral trade agreements. So that would be one. You know, they should be appreciative of that. The second is, again, reinforcing Gordon's point, this is an Arab Muslim democracy. There are not many of those. Maybe one. You know, I can't think of another. So that's worth encouraging, and they should appreciate that. And the third thing I'd say is, here's a major non-NATO ally. Yeah. We don't have many allies in that part of the world. This is a source of strength here, and we ought to reinforce that.
Anne, do you want to add anything? Yeah. If I could just add, like, I think Tunisia has the benefit these days at a time when Middle East policy is so emotional and very sort of politicized and divided. It seems to me the place, you know, it's not Yemen or Syria or places like this. It's a place where you could actually continue to invest a lot and help the society help themselves. And then secondly, I'd add, I just was in Berlin yesterday and the day before at a U.S.-German exchange, and I was really impressed the degree to which the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung and the Germany was actually still engaged deeply in a place like Tunisia and brought a lot of experts and have a presence there. And it's one of these places which I think you might be able to sell this to Donald Trump, that there are other countries that are pulling their weight to help Tunisia help itself. And it's one of these places, again, if they had the bandwidth, if we didn't have such a crazy policy and political debate here in Washington, it's just a steady place where you can invest and probably reap some benefits from it, as opposed to the things that we always focus on, which are just the Frankenstein nightmares of the Middle East today. So we have time for a few more. Yeah, sir, right here.
Amin Mahmoud, Center for Egyptian-American Relations. My question to Anne also. The violation of human rights well known in Egypt to everybody here and in Europe, and regardless of military coup or not, he killed thousands of people, that's Sisi, and now he's tampering with the Egyptian constitution to stay forever or until 2034, and he consolidate also all branches of government in his hand according to the changes coming, and this will kill any hope for democracy. Now, with your experience in Egypt, what you expect when the people will uprise and might be surprised, all of us might be surprised, the rest or stability in Egypt will lose it, and it might be chaos to Egypt and to the whole world.
Well, actually, my own judgment, and I hesitate to say this, but my own judgment is that Egypt will rock along for quite a while in this rather unattractive state. They've had some progress on the economic side. They've had some gas discoveries. Egypt is a real country with institutional structures. But I think what is going to be I think there are two issues. One, the huge demographic problems if there's not job creation. And this economic progress has not yet evolved into job creation for this massive, massive youth bulge. And the quality of Egyptian education is very bad indeed. And the second thing is maybe the military will go along with President al-Sisi staying forever, but that wasn't true with Field Marshal Tantawi, a precedent of which President al-Sisi is well aware. So there may be support for him to stay, but how much longer? And these two issues, I think, could coincide at some point. The demographic pressures, I think the Arab Spring, it may look like a failure now, but I think it very much changed the perception of Arabs. So you could have these two issues, I think, coinciding at some point in the future. We just don't know when that would be.
We have time for two more. Sir, right here. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm Benjamin Tua, no current affiliation. Bill Taylor referred to the Congress briefly, and my question concerns the role of the Congress in foreign policy making. The House of Representatives seems poised to enter into a broader discussion on Middle East issues, particularly on Palestine, Israel, and including taboo or demonized developments such as the BDS movement. How do you see this playing out in the House of Representatives, in the Senate, and in the public at large? Thank you.
Want to respond to that? Gordon, Bill? I mean, I'll just say it's a little outside of the scope of what I think we're talking about, and I'll give my own impression that it's understandable why these debates, I think, are so emotional. And if you see what happened, and I caught it from Germany on Monday, Tuesday, we had Congresswoman Ilhan Omar here on Tuesday last week to talk about her views on religious freedom. My sense is, and I'm somebody who lived in Palestine in the West Bank and Gaza 20 years ago, how you move the ball forward to help Palestinians and Israelis feel secure and prosperous is much more complicated than the debates that we've been having the last few weeks. it required, and we had a discussion here in September on Palestine and aid to Palestine, which I think, again, maybe we can bring it up in the context of Middle East transitions and what we should or shouldn't be doing. We shouldn't forget Palestine. To me, and this was a point of the discussion in September, is that cutting U.S. aid to hospitals, to people in Gaza, at this time, as part of a pressure strategy, is not likely to yield stability or prosperity in the long run. It actually, I think, undercuts the hope of any sense of justice or peace. And these debates, they're all important, is what I'm saying. It's very important that voices are out there, pressing the limits of their debate. But to me, the things that we're talking about here, the sort of tools that America might be able to bring to bear in the West Bank and Gaza is an equally important discussion. If you hadn't a chance to see it, I hope you have a chance to look at it. It's online. In September, we had a friend from Gaza actually appear via the internet from Catholic Relief Services, Bassam Nasser. And what he had to say at the end of the impact, the types of aid that I think we're trying to talk about on this panel here, is extremely important. And as important as what I think are very, very important, sometimes emotional debates about different tools of trying to advance justice, peace, and Palestine from Palestinian Israelis. So sorry for as moderator responding to that, but I think it's not going away as a discussion. But I would also put as much emphasis on the tools that we can do to help people in the occupied territories build a better future for themselves. I think we have time for one or two more. Sir, you've been very patient down front. Sorry.
Thank you. I'm a foreign development retired officer, and good to see Ambassador Anna. I worked for you temporarily in Cairo during the difficult time. I actually looked better than when you were there under the pressure. A couple of things. I think that, I'm sorry?
What's your name?
Mohammed Tanami. I think there are a couple of things that were not mentioned maybe directly about the failure of the lack of support of the U.S. government. I think one of them is the lack of the right intelligence. And we have a tendency to forget that, during the Iraq War, we have very, very little information about what's going on. The same thing in Egypt, in Tunisia, and so forth and so on. The stuff that was percolating under the surface, we were not very knowledgeable about it.
Okay.
So I want to see if anybody can comment on that. The other question is, we're looking forward. I think the Arab world, especially a country like Egypt, is really in deep economical trouble. Right. Lack of tourism and so forth and so on is just hammering the economy.
Right.
The question is, would the U.S. government plus the European allies suggest to the Sisi regime and others to start talk to the opposition? Thank you.
Great. So the first question was the lack of political intelligence. You mentioned something about actually having a good read. I think you all did, and understanding the dynamics. But do you think today, in 2019, given the cuts that have happened in the department and what's gone on, do you think we're flying a little bit more blind, or and were there things that we didn't anticipate?
I think it's, even the greatest intelligence agency and all the national technical means in the world, you can't divine human intentions or what's going to happen. So in the narrow sense, there was absolutely no prediction that a self-immolation on December 17th, 2010 in the middle of Tunisia was going to make Ben Ali leave exactly 4 weeks later. I don't say that apologetically, because certainly Ben Ali didn't know it was coming either, and he lived there his whole life. But I think in the broader sense, it was not exactly a surprise that people in Tunisia were unhappy with the Ben Ali regime. We saw a number of factors. I got there in September 2009. Summer 2008, there had been great labor unrest in the center of the country, not for the first time, but that was the most recent time. The October 2009 elections revealed great dissatisfaction. The kind of post-election jockeying within the ruling party, which was opaque to us, but not so opaque that we didn't know there was dissatisfaction. So I think, were we omniscient? Absolutely not. Did we know everything that was going on? Absolutely not. But same time, it wasn't entirely, the pace was surprising, but the depth of the discontent wasn't surprising.
And it sounds like you all said that a bigger challenge was bandwidth back in Washington as opposed to understanding the landscape on the ground there, right?
Yeah, there was no question, and I wasn't there, but to be clear, I think everyone knew there was broad dissatisfaction in these societies. That was hardly a surprise. People have been tracking that for years, and I've heard David Satterfield, for instance, talk very eloquently about this. What I think people couldn't predict was the catalyst, and that's hard. That's hard.
And there was Mohammed, you had a second question on Egypt and the economy. Oh yeah.
Well, certainly that was the view when Bill Burns came out there not too long after President al-Sisi took over to try and. I would think the chances of that are extremely slim right now. That anyone would encourage the Egyptian government to talk to the opposition, and they have taken steps on the economic side with the IMF and with their gas discoveries that have had, I think, a positive impact on the economy. The problem is the lack of trickle down.
Well, the hour is upon us, and thank you all for listening to what was, I think, a great discussion. And please join me in thanking the panelists.
Thank you.